Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Feel free to ask questions anytime during during my flapping my gums up here. Hopefully, this will be interesting for you. If not, let's make it interesting. But first of all, let me ask, how many of you had an intro to philosophy class? Nobody. Okay, so this is fresh. All right. Does anybody know what secular humanism is? Nobody. Okay.
Something about humans, I guess.
Okay, good deduction. Yeah, uh-huh. Okay. Well, let me then start from basics. Basically, what I want to talk about is you don't necessarily have to believe in God at all in order to be a moral person, despite the fact that it's very difficult to be a moral person. So what I hope we can do here is I'm going to introduce some concepts that might be new, and if you're interested in it, like Professor Polanowski said, please challenge the arguments, challenge it with your own thoughts, so we can maybe have a dialogue. If not, then I'll continue to blab, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. Secular humanism is a worldwide phenomenon. It's a movement that is based upon the belief in universal egalitarian commitments. What does that mean? Egalitarianism. It means equality for everybody. Not only that, the term secular means typically non-religious. Non-religious. And humanism, as it was deduced by this fine young man, has something to do with our commitment to human beings, or people, or society. So therefore, this movement, which is all over the world, you have organized, very large organized groups and bodies of political activists who are interested in this universal egalitarian commitment to value inquiry and to human rights and to moral consciousness or conscientiousness that's based upon reason and it's based upon scientific knowledge rather than on any theological belief whatsoever. It doesn't focus on any supernatural premises that's grounded in religious faith or doctrine. In fact, it is very much opposed to even having to have any grounding in religion at all. It doesn't necessarily mean that these groups are adamantly opposed to religion, but they could be. Because like any kind of social group, it really all depends upon what individuals identify with and what they value. So, but one consensus is that humanism is a rational philosophy that's informed by science, that's inspired by art, and that is motivated by compassion for other people and for society as a whole. It's about affirming the dignity of each human being. And it supports liberty and opportunity that's consonant with societal and planetary responsibility. So it is free from theism. Theism means the belief in God. And in particular, theism is a belief in typically the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It basically is free of that, free of any supernatural kind of belief system or theological belief system or ideology. And an ideology is basically brainwashing people to think certain ways, and that have been socially conditioned and is part of a social kind of belief system. And what it wants to assert instead is that what's most important is humanity, and that we as humanity need to take responsibility for our own destiny. So, usually the secularism humanistic debate falls into three camps, and I've outlined them for you. One is the theism-atheism debate, meaning the belief in God versus there is no God debate. So I'm going to go into certain types of arguments for the existence of God and the non-existence of God, just to give us an overview, particularly given that you haven't had a class in it. But the other elements are the secular debate, and the secular debate is debates within the community that believes in this. And just like any community, there's different and divergent points of view. Not everybody's going to believe and think the same thing. They're not going to value the same thing. Certain people are going to, have certain views or perspectives or takes on matter that other people might not agree with. And that, like any kind of group, you're going to have internal critique and criticism and non-agreement. And then the third element has to do with the morality debate. And the morality debate really has to do with arguing about what is the source and the content of our values. Now, I'm not going to spend much time at all in the secular debate. It's particularly given that you haven't really heard of the movement. But it's a very politically active group. In the United States, there's the American Humanist Association that lobbies for free thought. Free thinking is what they would call it, meaning that you're not constrained by the assumption that there is a father in the sky that dictates everything. And they are very active in trying to deal with to what degree the one has the right to religious freedoms that are within the public versus the private domain. And we see this happening all the time, where the private becomes part of, or the church and state issue becomes, part of legal matters such as the abortion issue, such as the right to have religious freedoms and to what degree they should be public. So let's go back to the first one. Let's just get this out of the way. And this is what might be interesting, because many of you, I would assume, have been grown up particularly in the Bible Belt, with probably thought or learned or taught that there is a God, and that everything around the way we live our lives is in relation to a theistic supreme being. The secular arguments, particularly those who are more atheists, one doesn't have to be an atheist at all. One could be an agnostic, meaning that they don't know. So the notion of gnosis is having knowledge. There's one that says they have no knowledge, so they don't pass a judgment whether there's God or no God. It's just suspended. You have other people that want to redefine what God is. However, the atheist is the person who doesn't believe. So regardless of what other people's beliefs are, The atheist is the person who's godless. And it's as if it's not like it's an inherently negative thing. It's just they don't have any attachment to the notion of God at all. However, when other people do, and they impose their value systems upon the masses, this is what leads to certain types of resistances, and where the secular humanist movement starts. It is to question whether or not we should adopt, buy into, or accept other people's beliefs and views. And to what degree should we accept them in the sense that we must buy into their premises and grant them the same level of validity that a free thinker would require. And that is thinking critically about whether or not it makes sense to believe in a supreme being. To what degree do we understand what a supreme being is? And at the same time, one can have extreme respect for other people's beliefs and dignity. And as long as you make that private, you don't make that a public issue that interferes with all of society. And hence one could be quite accepting, tolerant, even validating of your belief system, your point of view, your lifestyle, your faith practices, and that's one kind of secular humanist stance. However, there's others who could be very anti-theist, meaning they're more militant in their beliefs. They think it's harmful to society to have these views, and hence they're more likely to challenge the status quo. And hence that then certainly dovetails into the secular debate when it comes to religion in society, and to what degree that should become part of our legal system, and to what degree it should not. However, let's go back to some basic stuff. And that is to question the presumption that there is a supreme being. So let me try to define it, because there's many ways you can conceive of God. Basically, I'm talking about the pedestrian notion of God, meaning the common man's view. And that would be that the universe was created by a supreme being who brought everything into existence and is the cause of the universe and everything in it. And also, people attach certain types of qualities to this supreme being as being all perfectly good, omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, all-knowing, and a number of other types of what we call omni-properties that are usually very value-laden, and they usually are very positive, in the notion of a supreme supernatural being. Well, there are so many different ways of viewing this. So the first would be to, address the notion of, why we should even remotely believe in a supreme being. What are the arguments for it? And in a nutshell, I'm going to just try to focus upon three or four main issues. And that is, we'll start with my favorite, what's called the ontological proof. Now, what this means, ontology means a field of the study of being, or reality, let's say. What is, what exists. And it's a very broad field. So the notion of ontology dealing with what exists, one would say, what is the ontological proof for the existence of God? Well, this was made very famous by Saint Anselm, who posited that God is the greatest of all possible things we can conceive, we can imagine, we can think. Than that which is impossible to think anything greater, is what he said. And since actuality is greater than just an object of thought or understanding, God must exist in reality. So, can you think of anything greater than a supreme being who has everything that, every element of every property, every disposition that, of course, human beings don't have, and it would be to conceive of this perfect being, of which nothing greater can be conceived? Well, basically, just because you think something doesn't make it so. You can't think something into existence. Existence is not a predicate. No proposition proves itself just because you make an assertion. So you can't define God into existence, no matter how sophisticated you are in terms of your reasoning, in terms of your use of logic. And the thing is that no matter how you define your propositions, that just doesn't pop into existence. So at most you can say is that God is a concept, not an object. And no amount of logical sophistry can change that fact. That's what an atheist response would be. We can't reason God into existence any more than we can attribute the actuality of the physical universe to be the sole product of my mind, as which that wouldn't make sense. So that, in a nutshell, is the ontological proof. Just because you have a thought of God doesn't mean God exists. So what other kinds of arguments have been given? Well, the next is probably the most common. We call it the Cosmological Argument. Now basically, this is in pithy form. The universe was caused and it came into being. So again, the cosmos, the universe. So it was caused and it came into being and could only exist if it was brought about by a first cause. And yet this first cause must be uncaused. So this goes back to many different philosophers in history of Western thought in particular. It could be from Aristotle's unmoved mover to more Christian theology. But nevertheless, this uncaused cause is God. And God is unconditioned, meaning it's not caused by anything else, because it's its own cause. God is self-caused. Now, the atheist would say, all of this begs the question on what is causality, what is creation, and what is the beginning of existence itself, including, how can the coming into the being of the universe be caused by presupposing some supreme being in the sky? How can space and time be caused by something that is uncaused? And basically, this argument presupposes the very thing it must set out to prove. Why should I accept these premises? Because they are ridiculous. This is what some provocative response might be. So there's no sound justification for positing some omnipotent, self-caused God. Omnipotent being all-powerful. I mean, obviously you have to be all-powerful if you're going to create the universe and bring it into being and bringing everything in the universe into being and sustaining the universe and appealing to some omni-property, now the property being here all-powerfulness, to explain this omni-act of creation, fails to explain how the omni-act is even remotely possible. How is it that something can be created in such a large scale from this presupposed supernatural agent? So all of that is challenging the fact that why do we need to posit the cause of the universe or the cause of the cosmos when we could say that the cosmos has always been here, always existed in some form, and always will be? We don't need to have, a supreme deity in the sky that is, sustaining it, let alone causing it. Now, whether or not that is very convincing, there are other arguments that theists will want to put forward. And one of the most probably recognizable one, at least for you, would be something that's been popularized within the last couple decades. It used to be called the Teleological Argument, and now it's called intelligent design. Now, teleology means a purpose. It means a final end goal, at least traditionally. So, this argument is that the universe was not only ultimately caused by God, but it was due to his or her or its divine intentionality. There is an intention to create the universe, the cosmos. And this intention is hence a purposeful one. That's where the term teleology comes from, as intelligent design. So in order to explain the existence of the natural world, what we're in right now, and all the phenomenon that occurs in our natural world, God is presupposed as an intentional agent, a person nonetheless, the person of God, who caused it all. So rather than just appealing to the universe as it appears to us, how we experience it, God's predicated to be the designer or the architect of it all, of all that is. Now, notwithstanding the circularity of the argument, here again, we're presupposing the very thing that needs to be proven, needs to be argued for why it exists. The response to that is that it doesn't explain away the problem of what we would call an infinite regress. So if you have an original cause that brought something into existence, and that original cause is uncaused because it's self-caused, but you're always appealing to an antecedent event that brings out a consequence. So when you are appealing to a cause that brings something about, an effect, one would ask, what comes before the initial event? What precedes God's existence, so to speak? You're always going to be going back in time, down a ladder, down a rabbit hole, into appealing to a previous antecedent that is the cause of some event. And hence, we call that an infinite regress. You're regressing, always appealing to a prior cause that brought something about. So hence, the cosmological argument and the intelligent design or teleological arguments are all simply begging the question. You can't presuppose the very thing that it's incumbent upon you to prove. Now, of course, all of this is complicated by how do we find an escape hatch here? How do we find how do we reason our way into trying to salvage this notion of a divine deity that brought things together? Well, a lot of theologians or theistic responses often rest upon the arguments of fine-tuning. That's what they call it, fine-tuning. And this relies upon what they call an anthropic principle, which claims that the laws of physics are so finely adjusted to such a degree that the universe could never have come into being nor supported carbon-based life without divine intervention. So it's so statistically improbable that we are even here. The mere fact that we just take life or existence for granted, how could that be? It's so improbable we'd be here. We're the only life-sustaining planet that we are aware of right now in the universe. The one that we inhabit, by the way. How could there ever be these constants that we customarily define as natural causal laws, like the law of gravity? Because these things must have arisen from initial conditions. That's why they say it must be designed. Hence, that is another defense for the intelligent design argument. In a nutshell, it's a miracle that we're here. That there could be any universe that supports life. And these laws have to be here in order to sustain the cosmos, which is very delicately balanced to begin with. It's so statistically remote that we would even be here. It's so existentially improbable that we need to account for how this is possible. Because it's so complex and the improbability of such that it just cannot be explained by chance or by randomness. So it makes no sense whatsoever that a life-sustaining universe could exist in the absence of an intentional creator. Therefore, the universe was designed by God. That's the argument. Well, is that conclusion warranted? This would be the retort. We would have grounds to expect that a universe that permits human life would surely allow for observers to discover the laws of nature. For what else would we expect to observe? We're here. What we expect to observe would necessarily be restricted by the conditions of existence itself that allows for observers, for human beings. So of course the fundamental constants will be such that it permits the development of life. We don't need to appeal to, again, this supernatural creator agency in the sky, let alone that God intended for all this to be here. So, what the atheists would say in response to all these eloquent arguments would be the evidential argument. Where is the evidence for God? Following logical and pragmatic criterion of evidence, God's predication would not meet any empirical standards for the existence because God cannot be proven as a fact or demonstrated to exist as an actual reality or an entity. For God's neither appeared nor manifested as an actual being. Basically, the argument goes, where's God? I haven't seen God. I haven't experienced God. I've not witnessed God. Just because other people say there's God, they think there's God, there's no reason for me to believe that. Has God ever manifested? Ever appeared? Other than a thought? Other than an idea? That's why God's merely the invention of an idea. It's a thought. So, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. That would be the response that a rational life philosophy would have, that a scientific worldview would have, and that often dovetails into the support for secular humanism. We don't need to believe, let alone necessarily believe, in a supreme being in order to be human, in order to be human beings that strive to be better. In fact, there are some interesting arguments that we call, rather than the proof for the existence of God, we'll call them disproofs. And one comes from formal logic, from propositional logic. We call it modus tollens. And in Latin, that means the mode by which denying denies. And it's set out in a certain inferential form. It is in standard logic, it would be if P, therefore Q, meaning Q is the consequence. If we accept the premise, if P, then therefore Q. There's no Q, therefore there's no P. What that means is that if there is a God, God should be present. God's lack of presence, hence absence, therefore there is no God. It's a valid logical form, inferentially true, but of course, like anything else, as a disproof for God, all one has to do is quibble with the premises, and one could either agree or not agree. And this basically could apply to anything. Okay. What the response to a theist would be, well, you have to prove there's no God. Besides this logical proof that there's no God, the atheist would simply say that, a philosopher is never called on to prove a negative. For the burden is on one who's predicating existence. They call it existential affirmation, namely the existence of the God. You're the one who's saying God exists. I don't need to prove something that's not even there. How is it that you cannot prove the non-existence of something when by definition there's nothing there to prove? We don't need to prove a negative, especially when there's nothing present. Negation is self-evidence by virtue of absence. So this is what if whatever your beliefs might be, you're going to be encountering other people who come from this point of view. Now, whether or not you agree with them, believe in them, find their form of argumentation valid or acceptable or questionable, the secular humanist is going to say it doesn't matter because we're all human beings. And ultimately, this is where what really matters is the way we relate to one another and treat one another. And hence, this is what goes back to the main theme of secular humanism. And that is, we have an ethical responsibility to humanity. And a lot of people view this as a life philosophy, that they don't necessarily want to live in a society where certain untruths are fostered, but they might just have to live in coexistence with the fact that I don't believe we'll ever see the eradication of organized religion. And there's many reasons for it, which I'll get into in a bit. But the main thing here is that regardless of belief, we're united as people who should be, and this is part of a prescriptive line of argument, we should be interested in the welfare of everybody. We should be interested in equality among our fellow human beings. And we should treat people in a way that they are what we value more than belief in anything. So in many ways, this is, secular humanistic thought is a, worldview. It's a life philosophy, and it's devoid of any of these metaphysical assumptions that, that I just went through. It's really about, yeah.
Let me stop.
Yeah.
So let's, coming from, let's say, a theistic point of view, somebody might say, so there are two potential objections. One objection is, if you get rid of the God, theistic God, then you are running a risk of nihilism. Namely, you have no grounds for moral claims. And ultimately, people then can say, if there is no foundation for moral claims, because there is no God, then why should I do anything? Why should I play according to any moral theory that is out there, regardless which one you choose, whether it's virtue theory, ontological theory, whatever you throw it out. And the second objection to this is that you just said we start with a presupposition that we should treat each other equally. That strikes one as a kind of a religious tenet. Why should I treat people equally? Now, you can say, well, that Jesus' principle, treat others how you want to be treated, but that principle doesn't work because, first of all, pragmatically it doesn't work. We don't treat other people like we want to be treated. We quite often treat people worse. We expect them to treat them better. And second of all, we don't treat people equal. As a matter of fact, maybe one could argue we would be disturbed if we came across somebody who treats everybody equally. The way I treat you is not going to be the way I treat my students, or I treat some stranger on the street. If I suddenly treated everybody the same, then one would say, that's an odd tenet that needs some kind of support. That's a presupposition, and it sounds like a religious presupposition.
Agreed, true. In defense, I imagine the humanist would want to say, but these are aspirational. These are things that we try to live up to, even though we will be imperfectly and incapable of achieving them. It's the notion of a universal principle. So while I agree with you that we do not remotely think of others as equal, let alone treat them that way, the notion, though, is again, I'm trying to provide a defense or an argument for this line of thinking, is that if we were to view others as at least equal in a aspirational sense, meaning that we acknowledge that everybody has their own inner experiences, their own lives, their own emotions, their own needs and desires. And in that way, we are united as a collective people. So the mere fact that I can recognize you as a subject, as a human being that's distinct from me and my identity, because I see myself in you. I can see that you are a human being that has needs, that has values, that wants to be treated in a way that I would want to be treated. And yet, we're so imperfect, we'll never be able to treat people that way. However, I believe in the fact that, the I is in the we, and the we is the I. So hence, we are experiential subjects. And we have, as moral creatures, meaning as ethical creatures, assuming we've achieved some state of empathy for other people, the need for validation, for recognition, even though we recognize that you exist and you have needs, even though they might be different than mine. At least I want to acknowledge or validate that. But yes, the same argument applies. Why should I presuppose it? The other issue is why should if I don't have God anchoring everything, I'm going to be a nihilist. Well, look at the way people treat each other now. Look at the way the world is. Look at society. The world's on fire. Everything's flooding. There's drought. There's rise in tides. I mean, you can see all of this as the biblical apocalypse. All of these are signs of the end of the world. We can go on and on, right? But the notion is that if God does exist, is God helping now the world? Isn't the world acting the same way that you just said, that people are, killing each other everywhere, butchering going on, no respect or no regard for the other? In many ways, we do live in a techno world of nihilism, where there's an abnegation of responsibility. Go online, rate somebody, diss somebody. And this brings in a different problem, a different set of problems. And that is what psychologically drives us? What motivates us? What are all the internal conflicts that are unresolved that spew over into collective societies? So I don't profess to have the answer to that. And I believe we're all in the same kind of boat, that we have to navigate this on our own, in our own way, through our own circuitous routes, and arrive at these decisions of how one wants to live one's life, how one wants to view others within their community. And that's basically an existential quest that only you as an individual can engage in. Yes, it's nice to have guideposts along the way. It's nice to have other inspirational messages. And for those who get comfort from a supreme being as a ground for why we should live a good life, why we should live a moral life, then good for them. Pragmatic, I'm a pragmatist in that sense. However, it's not necessary. And that's what the humanist would say. It's irrelevant whether there's a God or not. The bottom line is, what do we value? And that's the problem. That's the morality debate. The person who lives a nihilistic life, there is no values. Well, that's a universalist or absolute statement. There is no values. Well, if there is no value, you're just making an absolutist claim. That's a value judgment. So hence we have to deal with our own contradictions. But again, I'm not here to defend the what a pure humanist would be. And this maybe is what kind of unites people together in some bond. That's what religion means. Religio means bind, a binding together. It's what keeps people together. And ultimately, I feel that's based upon an ethics of being. How do we want to live one's life? How do we want to relate to other people? What values do we have? This is all debatable. But we do often find that there are collective identifications with certain values, such as who doesn't feel that loving people is a good thing? Just like you would want to be loved by your parents growing up, feeling loved by your parents, gives you a sense of groundedness that you're wanted, that you have value and worth, and that you're recognized as a distinct human being that is loved. Hence, it's not a coincidence that would find its way into Judeo-Christian particular ethos. How about others? What's your thoughts so far?
Are you saying that we are using religion as a place value in our lives?
As a place of value?
Yeah.
Or,
Or like our standards of value?
well, I guess that you'll have to tell me what those are for me to understand.
Well, like, don't hurt anyone, don't lie to anyone, stuff like that. So like if we don't have religion, then we would just do all this carelessly.
But we have religion all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like if we didn't, then
Yeah, but we have, let's say there's over 6 billion people out of 7.5 billion that exist. And those 6 billion people have beliefs in every type of form of world religion. And yet we still see empirically that we continue to hurt, kill, exploit other people. So the argument is that has God helped really, if that's the case? But from an individual standpoint, if that's what you feel grounds your reasoning for why you should be a certain way and act a certain way, and feel a certain way, then that would be your justification as a subject. However, let's appeal to naturalized psychology, meaning our own minds and our own psychological makeup. Oh, you have a question?
So, religion. Okay, how am I gonna word this? I feel like people are scared of death, so they just came up with religion, and then religion became this.
Beautiful. Give him an A. Yes, that would be one argument from a psychological point of view, that even though you have the argument for desire, we all desire, let's say, I'm going to universalize this just for making a point. The notion is that we desire a supreme loving agent. It in many ways has the promise of an afterlife. It's extremely powerfully comforting to believe in an ideal being. For one's anxieties, conflicts, and our emotional pain are mitigated by believing in this divine beneficence that promises a satisfying afterlife. Now, the belief in this afterlife makes personal and daily existence more tolerable, with the dream that deep down, sometime in the future, when you perish, you'll have everything that you desire, but are deprived of in our current momentary life. Death no longer becomes an ending in itself, but rather an Eden, where all cherished wishes and values are realized, the perfect world. Well, God is, the signifier for this salvation, for this everlasting tranquility or bliss. However, we have good reason to believe that we're ultimately terrified of dying. And in order to deal with our own impending mortality and death, God becomes a fiction, a myth, a projected, ideal being that's going to give you what you would always have hoped for as the fulfillment of your wish. Yeah.
So what would be the purpose of existence if there was no final destination or goal for your living? Like if everybody's going to die and there's nothing afterwards, then what would be the point of even having more morals or wanting to make the world a better place?
Yeah, that's a standard theological argument, that we need to have a God. In fact, if we didn't have God, we would have the need to invent him. That's what Voltaire said. The fact is that you have to accept reality on its own terms. That this is all there is. This is what we're thrown into, whether you like it or not. And hence, it's an urgency of wanting to live one's life more authentically and to take responsibility for your own, being and becoming, what you can do to fulfill and find a meaningful life. So I might not like it either. Well, I don't like it. No one likes the thought that at some point in the future we will cease to be. But to say, well, gosh, that if we don't have God or an afterlife, everything's meaningless. What's the point? But one would say, yeah, but that's the point. The point is that you have to find your own meaning, create it. And this is the existential creed. That whether you're here now with godless or whether you have God, you're still in the same boat. You still have to decide and choose how you want to live your life and what makes life more meaningful and pleasurable, or how do you want to be happy? Part of it is, of course, the philosophical quest. How does one want to live a good life? And humanists say you don't have to have that in order to be a good person. Other things that you value, you can focus your energies on. And instead of looking at death as your enemy, you look at it as an ally. Because that means that you're no longer living in denial. Think of this. People do not think of these bigger metaphysical existential questions until they're on their deathbed, typically. Have you ever seen parents, grandparents die? When you live your life freely, one has to accept everything that comes your way. And there's no guarantee. So given that there's no guarantee, you still have the same demands that are placed on yourself. And that is what kind of person you want to be. How do you want to relate to others? What do you value? What do you want to accomplish in this limited time you're here? In fact, one could argue that death makes life more meaningful. It makes it more worth living, because that means that in every instance, you have to choose how you want to be and how you want to live. not having some ready-made prescriptions that are just thrown on you and you being told you have to do this and that.
And to kind of piggyback on John's idea, if you think about religions that promise you afterlife, what is rooted behind that is an implication that the current life is not as valuable as the afterlife. So the current life, so to speak, is a foyer to the dining room that is on the other side. But notice, that's an assumption. And if you happen to be, or I happen to be wrong about this assumption, then we quite often devalue our current life because we have a promise of continuous existence. So I'm wasting my time, and you say to me, well, don't you feel bad about wasting your life? And my answer is no, because there is more life coming. Imagine, think about it in terms of kind of pragmatic dimension of it. Think about money. So imagine that you can never run out of money. Will you value it as much? If somebody says to you, you only have $10,000 for your entire existence. So every cent you spend, you're running out of it. So what John is basically saying is, if you start thinking about your life as this is all that is given to us. If there is afterlife, it's a great, if you die and find out these stupid philosophers were wrong, then my God, that's like a frosting on a bloody cake. But if there is no afterlife, then the meaning is to be made now. The second part with religion is that, and that's my concern with religious claims, is that people quite often who make religious claims engage in epistemological hubris. Namely, they say, I know exactly how things are. So whatever you are thinking, unless you are thinking the way we are thinking, you are wrong. From that epistemological claim, it's not very difficult to imagine that somebody is saying, now I am justified to treat other people as not quite as equal to me as they should be, precisely because they are wrong. And because they are wrong, it is my obligation to correct them. And hence, religious conflicts that are really rooted in epistemology. Because the moment we recognize that nobody really knows what's going on, that our understanding of the universe is solid, suddenly when I'm looking at you and thinking to myself, I'm ignorant about this stuff, and you are ignorant about this stuff, and we both recognize it in each other, we're going to develop more empathy towards each other, simply because we are both lost. And quite often with religious people, the notion of loss is exterminated. You want to know how things are? Read the New Testament, read Quran, read Old Testament, Torah. That's how things are. Accept it and try to live it up. And as John suggests, the history of humanity has been replete with religious movements, religious ideologies. Think about the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church was in charge of the entire Europe. And it's not accidental we call it Dark Ages, because religious people were in charge and they mismanaged human civilization. So I very much empathize with this idea of creating value precisely because you don't know what's going on. So you say, I might be gone tomorrow, so what am I going to do about today? And you can think of it as much a religious calling as any other religious calling is there. Kind of maybe recognizing, saying, this is the only life that I have. I better acknowledge that to myself. And if I truly take that seriously, I will value it much more.
Well, I agree with that. But unless you are living with the thought that you have this life to determine where you go in the afterlife, that places more value on the current life that we have.
Yes, so I guess my concern is, and maybe John's concern would be, that if you think that there is afterlife, then you might not put as much emphasis on your own current biological life, precisely because you are thinking there is more to it. Remember when we talked about Russell, and I said something to the effect, we talked about the difference between morality and ethics. And I said something to the effect that if somebody says to me, if you ask somebody, why are you unwilling to commit murder? And somebody says, well, because God prohibits it. There are two problems with it. The first problem is that somebody basically is saying, God is irrational. God doesn't have any reasons for creating this commandment. God just says, don't kill other human beings. But if you want to investigate whether she has any reasons for that commandment, the answer is no. She just commands it, and we have to hear it, so to speak, and follow it. And the other problem with that is that if you rely on religion as a way of kind of justifying your moral values, then what do you do with somebody who one day wakes up and says, you know what, I used to believe in God. People do it all the time. And then something happens, or maybe it's a gradual kind of existential dripping, kind of Chinese torture, doubt slowly seeping in. And you are suddenly you wake up one day and you say, I used to believe in this, but I no longer do.
Then they would feel like they could do whatever they wanted to.
Yes, but notice, somebody who recognizes the fleeting nature of existence, so namely, you'll say to yourself, there is nothing more, that's it. So whatever value I can squeeze out of it, it's going to be now, because once my biological activity sees I'm done, there is no elevator upstairs or even downstairs. It's like imagining, what does it mean to be dead? Well, imagine how you felt before you were created. That's exactly how death might be, Socrates says. And if that's the case, then maybe creating your own value and kind of saying that matters precisely because I can disappear tomorrow might be much more meaningful than any type of promise that is given to you about afterlife. And we all struggle with it. It's, as John suggested, at the end of our life, you are 20 years old, you are young, you think you are immortal. I was there, I know exactly what I'm talking about. But older you get, you begin to think about your own existence as, you know what, they made these promises. But how do I know that they are true? They are promises. And, I'm looking back at my life and I have parts of my life that I regret. That basically say, I should have done this stuff, or I should have done something else, because I'm running out of time now. But when I was not doing it, I was at that point in which I was either thinking, well, there is life after death, don't worry about this. Or I was thinking, I'm immortal. Other people die, but I don't die. That's silly. What would it mean for me to die and not to exist? That just is a silly idea. So move on with your life. There is more stuff coming. And I think that's where the potential deception of religious movements come. Because they will, if you push them, they ultimately will say, well, it's faith. If you want a rational account, you can push it so far and no further. And if you expect more, then you don't understand what religion is about. Religion is about faith. And if you don't have faith, then we have no way of communicating anymore.
To follow up too, you said if there is no God, then I can do whatever I want. That's the point. You are free to choose how to live your life. You might choose to go down a negative path or a positive one. meaning that this is what the problem of evil was for Kant. It was about choice. It was about a person is free in their will, but do they freely choose evil? Of course, we have to debate what that means. But ultimately, whatever you do choose, your values, your ethos, how you want to live your life, how you want to treat other people, how do you want to relate to the world. The point is that you still are making your own choices, and they impact upon your personal sense of happiness. So even people who are stereotypically evil, bad, they do bad things to people, they hurt them, they exploit them, they still have to live with the consequences of their choices. And so in and of itself, it doesn't matter if you believe or don't believe, if your belief is that you'll be punished for doing bad things, and that's what keeps you in check. But we could also have the notion of natural law. And the natural law is that we do what feels good to us, or is ultimately produces positive effects, and they have tangible consequences on our happiness and our well-being. But that always involves our relation to others. We don't live in a solipsistic world. So our values, meaning what we take stock in and cherish, what we hold as sacred, could easily be viewed as evil to others. And hence we're always going to be negotiating with other people's minds and psyches. Not to mention that if one chooses to engage in a unsavory life, they'll likely suffer it in this lifetime. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know if you kill somebody, you're going to prison. In fact, it's not because of a commandment, thou shalt not murder. It's, if I do that, that's probably not a very good idea. Because the reality principle says, you're going to prison. Now, do you want to be in prison? I doubt that's a very good place to cultivate a sense of happiness. So this does open up a lot of issues around the choices we make, the imperative of how you want to live your life, what ultimately is meaningful. Now, some people believe that what's meaningful is, accumulating wealth, having possessions, having objects, but that really doesn't bring the quality of the lived experience to light, because people get bored with material things. In and of itself, it doesn't have the same value. Most people want to have meaningful relationships, or friendships, or romantic relationships, or good experiences with their children, family. And that's what brings them a sense of meaning, sense of happiness, pleasure. But there's so many elements to life, of living one's life aesthetically, artfully, of cultivating experiences. And the more that you cultivate experiences that are meaningful, pleasurable, enjoyable to you, that enhances the quality of your being. And clearly, the quality of one's life is less meaningful unless they have good friendships. That you're lucky if you can count on one hand your friends in a lifetime. You're lucky. In fact, you're lucky to have one. Now, how we define friendship, of course, is different for people. But again, the humanist perspective would be looking at what is of value in our present day life, not for some, transcendental illusion of a future afterlife. And even if one has it, it still doesn't abnegate their responsibility for living their life in an ethical way. Since I've been blabbing here the whole time, before we end, any other thoughts or any other questions? Maybe bringing this into a dialogue?
It's hard to argue the things that you were mentioning, because a lot of it was informational, but a lot of it, at least for me, was also things that I believe. So I fall under the category of possibly agnostic, because there is no proof that there is God, but there also isn't proof that there isn't. Right? How can you prove that? With the evidential argument, there's different ways that you can prove that. But again, no proof is proof that there can't be proof, right? But with the Bible is supposed to be the Word of God or something like that. But the Bible is written by man. So God is man's idea. I'm not arguing, I'm just stating.
So this kind of resonates with you. You've already thought about these things. And granted, let's say we don't know. The epistemological, meaning knowledge, is that we don't. And to claim certainty one way or the other may be quite an act of hubris. But nevertheless, some people don't like to sit on the fence. And it's uncomfortable living in ambiguity. But that's what life's about. We all have to tolerate ambiguity. And regardless of not knowing, it still doesn't mean that we are not responsible to live our own lives. And ultimately, there's some sense of empowerment to that, because you do have choices. And the choices that you decide to make and how you want to live can only be made by you. And nobody can give you happiness. You can't buy it. You have to cultivate it from within. And that is even more of a self-gift. If one can remotely approximate some of the tenets that are both humanistic, whether they are secular or sacred, is something that conjoins people, regardless of belief. In conclusion, I think we're all pilgrims on our own path, and I hope that you find a good one to take.